Lawmakers are set to consider potential changes to the state constitution that would have major ramifications for politics and government in the state. A proposal to create a commission to study the state constitution came before a committee of the legislature today. The commission would recommend changes and amendments to the constitution, such as the creation of a lieutenant governor, a post that the state currently does not have. Other proposals before the commission would include popular election of some state officers, such as the Attorney General and the Secretary of State. Another includes reducing the number of members of the legislature, and another lengthening the terms of Maine senators. The proposal was the subject of a public hearing today and will face votes in committee in the coming weeks. It would then head to the full legislature.